Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to today's session. I'm Prakash and I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Today, we're going to talk about thriving in a multicultural and inclusive environment. Before that, I'll give you a little background about myself. I work in the financial services sector, but I've always had a passion for coaching, for presenting. I finished my MBA, as Preston said earlier on, about 15 years back. And ever since then, I've been mentoring MBA candidates. I then got a qualification as a coach in an international institute. I'm accredited by the International Coach Federation and also with neuro-linguistic programming. These days, I do just presentations and coaching as a hobby. My day job is in the financial services. I do usually have 2 or 3 clients that I'm constantly coaching, usually in a voluntary basis and presenting these kind of sessions. I've done quite a few sessions with Bessem on similar topics across last year and earlier this year. And I think this is a new group that's coming in. So welcome to all the people who haven't been in any of my sessions before. Okay, on that note, I'll start. We have a healthy group today. There's about 25, 30 participants, which is good. Because it's not such a big group, what I will encourage is maybe questions throughout the session. Normally for a bigger group, I'll kind of limit it towards certain breakpoints throughout the presentation where I'll solicit questions and select. But at this point, I don't think it's a very big group. So I will encourage participation. Please, if I request you to just put your hand up, I can see the screen and I will be able to take your questions throughout the session. Ideally at the end of every slide. So if you can wait for me to finish the content of the slide, you can raise your hands whenever you want, but I will at the end of the slide invite some questions, and I would love this to be as interactive as possible. Okay, that is me and that's the topic. So this is, of all the presentations I do, this has got a little bit more theory in it. Usually I keep it to a very simple, practical level that addresses a wide range of audience. And I usually am passionate about simple things that make a big difference. I usually into it sounds nice, and then you think, what's that got to do with me? So I try and make it as close to practicality and something that makes effective that you can use effectively in your environment, whatever type of environment, whether it's social, whether it's working, etc. And hopefully it's relevant to most of you. So before I go ahead, I want to introduce a couple of definitions and concepts around multiculturalism. You can see the screen. And one of the main concepts I want to really bring about is working in a multicultural, inclusive environment is positive. It increases productivity and is enriching for personal and professional development. So those are 3 points I want to absolutely emphasize. Okay, I'll take a pause. I have one more favor to ask all of you before I proceed in this presentation. On the chat, I'm just posting a link. And basically, that's a link for feedback on the session. If I could request you to click on the link and have the web page open, please just make sure that when you finish, if you're leaving early or at the end of the session, not before, please, if I could request 2 minutes of your time just to fill the topics and give me some feedback, that will be really great. Okay, so going back to my presentation. Working in a multicultural environment increases productivity and it's enriching for personal and professional development. That's the headline statement, which I'm going to build on and develop that concept through each and every of those elements that I'm mentioning there. Okay, so the concepts are, we first try to understand human diversity. And we look at diversity in a holistic way. And I'll build on that a little bit. We will then see what are the human responses to diversity. When we are faced with diverse elements around us, around people around us, how do we respond? And using those two concepts, how does that translate into making it work for you? So that's kind of how I've divided the session. First part is understanding the diversity element of humanity. What are the different stages of human response to diversity? And then having delved into that, how do we make it work for you? Okay. There's a few assumptions I always put into play around throughout my session. While the concepts and the explanation of things will hopefully be easy to understand, the practice of that is never easy. In fact, I always, when I'm coaching clients, when I'm taking presentations, I always emphasize, it's a cliche, easy is nothing. Nothing in life is easy. Nothing in life is simple. It always requires adaptation, efficiency, and working hard towards getting things. We are all human. I know, again, another cliche. And it's important to acknowledge that it's not all formulaic in nature. We are all human. We all have gray space. We all have areas where it's not so black and white. And that's part of who we are. Okay. Hopefully there were no questions. I haven't introduced anything in detail, but I'm just presenting the structure of this session. Check if there's any hands up or anything. No. Okay, cool. So let's go into the understanding human diversity part. Before I go into diversity, when I talk about human diversity, and I'll encourage participation. So what makes human beings different? Can I invite some audience answers in terms of if you can kindly put stuff in the chat? When I say human beings are different, and what makes human beings different? I'll invite some feedback on the chat. Anyone wants to volunteer? If you want to just unmute yourself and say a word, that's fine as well. Languages, thoughts, good. Personality, okay. Different cultures, yep. Personal stage in development, values, different values, okay. Their ideas, religion, okay, religion is a good, family upbringing, perceptions, yep. All of these are very valid points. And I came out with a few things, nationality, background, indeed. So what I came up with a list, again, it's not a mutually exclusive list. Sex, okay, you could be male or female, that particularly distinguishes you. Age, so in terms of human groupings, different ages form different kind of groupings again. Place of birth, race, that's people have said nationality, background, etc., etc. That's a common grouping and differential factor. Human ability, and when I talk about human ability, it's a whole range of things, whether it's just being an able human being to the extraordinary ability of some human beings, sports people, scientists, etc. So human ability creates a sense of grouping as well. People mentioned religion. Yes, indeed, that's a good one. Education, I think some people mentioned that as well. When you talk of background, self-consciousness, education is also a very strong grouping. Interests, views, perceptions, family upbringing, some of those stuff as well. So basically, what are your interests and your views? And also profession and levels of profession and what levels you are in your organization, job titles, all those kind of things provide a sense of groupings. Now, not all of you might think of these groupings, and there might be additional groupings as well. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some common elements of groupings of how human beings look at diversity. So you've got, if you take guys hanging out together, girls hanging out together, young teenagers hanging out together, the mature people hanging out together, some from place of birth, you have a group forming with people from the same place of birth, same race, etc. There's a human ability, the scientists are all together, religious people in places of worship, they are together in a group. education when you're in school and certain levels of college, etc. You have certain levels of education, you form a group. Of course, interests and views, that's very common, and professional levels as well in the workplace, etc. That also creates that grouping. Yep, values, beliefs, all of those stuff, absolutely. So now my question becomes, how do human beings respond when they meet someone from a different grouping? Okay. Anyone wants to put something in the chat? Encounter another human being with a different grouping to what we think. Okay, stereotype, isolation, yeah. Expectations, yes, that's a good one. Tolerance, yeah. Distrust, curiosity, I like curiosity indeed. Okay, that's a few. Thank you very much for that. So one of the things I will mention is curiosity. That's a very common, I must say, logical level of Robert Dills from environment to the identity. Okay, that's a bit high level. Good point. I'll accept that. So at a simplistic level, it's curiosity, an element of worry, bias. When I say fear, I translate fear into worry, but that comes to the same window. Someone already mentioned bias. There's a judgment, there's an impression. You quickly, the brain subconsciously rushes to a judgment and an impression. And so those are common impulses. Again, this is not the exhaustive list of impulses, but these are the common impulses. I'm sure all of us at some point in our life, from the day we were born, or at least from the day we have living memory to today, you have encountered some of these impulses when you have met people from a different group. And I'm talking about impulses. It doesn't mean that you carry the impulses. It's the first impulse when you meet someone from a different grouping. So go ahead. I think people are on the same page, but anyone wants to ask a question on what I've said so far? I'll take that as a no. That's fine. Okay. So why is diversity important? And it's a very crucial point. Why is this diversity? A lot of organizations, a lot of people are now increasingly embracing the concept of diversity. Sometimes you think it's all around us. Most of us work in corporations, or whoever works in corporations, you see that term used a lot. Why is diversity so important? And this is something I thought about in terms of articulation. Each human journey is individual, creating a unique richness of experience, perception, views, abilities, and approaches. That's a very, very crucial point to understand, that every human journey is unique. There are no two human journeys that are exactly the same. There might be similarities, but it's unique. And because the journey is unique, your experiences, your knowledge, your understanding, your perceptions, your views, your values, they have at least a small amount of uniqueness to everyone else. And that's important because it is scientifically, and it's proven, and I say scientifically proven as academic research, and I didn't want to do too much quotations here, but if you Google diversity and productivity, you will get tons of academic material which states that diversity increases innovation and creativity. And I'm going to explain how in a bit, but it's a headline statement that diversity has the impact of increasing innovation and creativity. So corporations subscribe to diversity not just because it sounds like a good thing, not just it sounds, the right thing. It actually has an impact on their bottom line. And that's why more and more organizations, I'm not saying that's the only reason, but that hugely helps more and more organizations adopt diversity as a theme across their organizations. Diversity also reduces risk. Again, a huge, huge factor. Organizations generally at some level are averse to risk. And by increasing diversity, the risk for the organization is reduced. Again, there's a ton of academic research that's done towards these statements. By all means, I can quote a few, but it's easy for you to just Google those things. The fact is these two are quite well-held beliefs in the corporate world, okay? And then I want to quote something, although I'm not quoting anything. This is something that stuck with me from when I first read it, because we talk about culture. I want to include inclusion as well from a different able-bodied person. So this theme, this presentation, this workshop, I want to talk about not just diversity from cultural perspective, but also different able beings. And this statement is actually very, very crucial. And this is actually, I wanted to quote this because when I first read it, I thought that is a fantastic statement. So if you read what's in the screen, an individual whose body has been damaged in an accident or is burdened with a mutation, something that's from birth, that renders its body radically different from other individuals, may be able to accommodate such abnormality. And in doing so, the individual may develop novel structures and behaviors not seen in other cases. Such accommodation can be particularly marked when it occurs early in life. Now, what does that even mean, right? So basically, when you, and the best example I give is if someone who's, let's say someone is blind, you will normally see that they adapt by having increased listening. So their perception and their interpretation of life is enriched by the sounds, because being blind, their perceptions of body language is limited, but that means their focus around sounds is higher. So in terms of how does the sound like and all that, they have enhanced listening, which means they're bringing a unique perspective to the discussion, to the elements. And so it's something very useful. Now, I know, George, you mentioned it's not really correct. Diversity increases frictions. Well, that is true. And I'm going to talk about frictions and conflict in a minute. There is a way to make even more productive use of friction. I'm going to use the term conflict in my session, but friction and conflict are synonymous in that respect. And I'm going to speak about that in quite detail. Okay. Any questions on the importance of diversity? George, I've addressed your comment. Anyone else wants to make a comment on voice? We're not that big a group, so I can encourage questions and comments at this point. Okay.
Diversity not every time inclusion.
Sorry?
Diversity not every time is connected with inclusion. Sometimes it's connected with broke one from another.
It's a very, absolutely. And it's a very interesting perspective. It's similar to what George is saying, that diversity doesn't always necessarily increase, has a positive impact. There is a risk for negative impact. And I agree. I absolutely agree. The statement I make is diversity has the potential in all cases to increase productivity and reduce risk. Diversity has the potential to increase conflict, but I'm going to expand that in a bit. Conflict can be very healthy in avoiding a concept called groupthink. Park that thought though. I have a slide specifically on conflict and why that management of conflict is crucial to make sure diversity is giving a positive outcome. So just bear with me. A few slides later, I will come back to the conflict that normally is associated with diversity and why that can actually be a very positive thing.
One
But
comment, just to make the comment better.
Sure.
We should start with the reality. So in reality, in the majority of the organizations, and I don't know how much experience you have in consulting lots of organizations on this, but in reality, many organizations struggle because the diversity was not included, was not laid down in an inclusive manner. And the environment that was around the organization was diverse. Sometimes they were forcing the organizations to become diverse and to do the percentages, and they didn't do them in the inclusive manner. Hence, in the most cases, diversity is actually bringing frictions initially, and you have to treat it, you have to enable it to make it inclusive. So it's nice that you put the future in, like diversity brings creativity, because you are right, and diversity reduces risks long-term, correct? Just that now the majority of the organizations are struggling because they don't know how to make it inclusive. And that's the key word in reducing risk. But we can come back.
Very good point, Massimo. No, I can address something it's a very high level.
Massimo and Prakash. The meaning is the communication. If you want to build bridge between people, diversity could be inclusive. But a lot of time, the people, for fear of for other, or even, like George said, is the policy of a lot of big company create wall, not bridge.
Absolutely.
Because they want.
So let me bring this back. No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Apologies, but I want to bring this back. Both of Massimo and you make a very important point, and that's something. Again, I should probably future sessions. I'll add that to the assumptions list. The concept is not for debate. Execution of a good concept is something that organizations have to do. Any concept, even a simple concept of, at the risk of sounding pedantic, if you create a door to let people in, but if the door is not properly constructed and really doesn't open, the door is not doing its job. Similarly, diversity as a concept is inalienable, it's undebatable. The way you execute that diversity, that's the skill of the organization. You could have a non-diverse organization, but if you're executing the homogeneous organization badly, it doesn't matter. You're still, inherent defects will still be present. And that's key as an organization. And as Massimo, you agreed as well, diversity as a concept is not debatable. How you execute that diversity is absolutely crucial. And I completely agree with you. And I work in the consulting world. I know exactly what you're saying. Organizations don't execute very well. That is a known fact. Otherwise, there wouldn't be consultants, right? If every organization executed well, there wouldn't be consulting organizations. So it's a very important point. I fully acknowledge that, but that doesn't make diversity bad. Diversity is a good thing. You need to execute it well. And I hope that that kind of links to what you're saying to the concept. The concept is not wrong. The execution still needs, and any concept, as a consultant, you would know, any concept, the concept is reasonably okay. The execution is where the meat is. At this point, I'm still only at the concept level. We will go into more practical things, maybe not at the organization level, but individual level. So I have a few exercises later on that I want to focus on the individual and how they react to diversity around them. How corporations execute diversity is out of scope of this session. I'll have to take that as a separate session if someone's interested. But this is more about concepts and theory of diversity and how as individuals we adapt to diversity. Does that help? Massimo and the other person who spoke, I didn't quite catch their name. I'll take that as a yes. Okay. Okay, so how do human beings respond? And there is, again, this is a concept. Again, it's a framework of responses. And there are 6 stages, right? And the 6 stages I'm going to present is, the first stage is denial, okay? And this is particularly true of multicultural people or multicultural or different abled people. There's like no acceptance of differences, no curiosity, no reaching out. It's a denial. We're all doing the same job. So this job is a parameter of what it is, whether you're diverse, whether you're not diverse, don't care, don't want to know, I don't believe there's anything different. That is the first stage of human responses. Now, I'm not suggesting that everyone has been in this stage, but it's a normal human response stage. And it doesn't mean that if you're in that stage, you're always in that stage. It's a framework to recognize that you could slip into that stage when something diverse comes across you. Second stage is a little bit of defense. And there it's acceptance that differences exist, but who I am is the best I can be, and I'm doing my job right. You guys are different than me. You have to learn to be with me. So it's a defense mechanism, you know, that subconsciously you accept you as the frame of reference, and you want the diversity around you to adapt to you. So you accept the diversity, but it's still in a defensive way. The third point is you don't quite say that you are the frame of reference. It is a little bit, yeah, I am who I am. You're also okay where you are, but I still want to do my things. And it's a minimization stage where you just put everything onto the diversity is not even acknowledged at a deep level. So these are the 3 slightly negative responses to diversity. On slight positive side, you will have acceptance. So here people accept this difference. They accept it's kind of positive, but it's reactionary in nature. So if a different diverse group comes in and there's a problem, you react to that by saying, okay, look, there's a problem, I'll react. It's a very reactionary mode of response. Adaptation, which is the next stage, is you're starting to build some curiosity. You're starting to build bridges. And I'm confident most of you in this audience would be at that stage where you've built bridges with something that's diverse across you. Okay? And you're a little bit curious. The real utopian stage of human reaction to diversity is integration. And I'm confident, I'm hopeful most of you have been in this stage as well, where you're really comfortable at the shared spaces. You're really comfortable in the culturally efficient communication. You're confident. There's no more extra curiosity. That curiosity is now at a stage where it's mutual curiosity, it's comfort, it's a shared space. There's no differences in terms of day-to-day activities. It's fully integrated. And that's the utopian response to diversity. Now, I'm going to take a little poll, and I'm going to ask, and I'm just going to see in the screen, can I have a hands up with an icon? You can just press the reaction. How many people have experienced the first stage, which is denial? Okay, no one? That's interesting. I know I have. How many people, oh, Robert has, thank you. How many people have experienced the second stage, which is defense, where you know there's differences, but you're defensive about the situation? Okay, a few hands there. Minimization. How many of you have been there? Okay, a few hands there as well. How many of you have been in acceptance stage? Okay, there's a lot of people in acceptance, that's for sure. Okay, you can put your hands down. And adaptation. Okay, quite a bit. And how many in integration? Interesting. There's not that many hands on integration. So that's positive if people are recognizing the responses and feel there is more to come for them. That's fantastic. Okay. Let's move on. Any questions on these 6 responses, or anyone wants to make any comments? Massimo says, if you accept, you also integrate the difference. Well, you can move from acceptance to integration, but you need to do more than accept. So just acceptance in this framework, acceptance is just saying, yes, people are different. Integration is you actually do something about it in a proactive way and integrate. You could choose to accept and not do anything about it and just say, I don't want to really do anything about the difference. Yeah, and as Juan says, there's different stages. Okay.
Prakash,
cool.
if I don't want to do nothing, I don't accept. If I'd accepted the difference, also I put them in the same, my word.
That's a semantic, and I respect that. And that might be again in your model of using the semantics. When you say, so whenever you accept the difference, you believe you naturally integrate. That's fine, and that might be a model of representation. In the case of this framework, there are 3 different stages. Acceptance is just the mental state where you accept that people are different, but you're not going to do anything about it. And if there's a problem, you will point towards the difference. But if there's no problem, you still remain as you are. That's the framework here. And I'm not saying maybe you don't have that model. When you accept, you naturally integrate. So you might be naturally across 2 models. But for the theory, those are 3 different models. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about cultural differences. And this is something, so very on in my MBA, I learned this, and there's something that stuck with me for the last 16 years. And I want to talk specifically about culture. And this is, so there's a famous scientist, philosopher called Gerd Hofstede. And I don't know if you guys have heard the name. And he was one of the pioneers of defining and putting some meat into the word culture. What does culture really mean? How do you talk about differences in culture? What is the, for example, the Italian culture different to the Indian culture, different to the British culture, to the French culture, to the Chinese culture, to the Latin American culture? What are these things? How do you say and define what a culture is? So what he did was, he did a whole survey of, he initially started off with about 2,000 people in IBM, because at that point, this is in the early 70s, I think. At that point, IBM was the most multicultural organization. So he did a lot of empirical research, and he originally came up with 5 parameters. It's now gone to 9 parameters of measuring culture and putting them into a box, into these separate elements, and then putting a score along those elements for each culture. And what that does is, it gives you numerical parameters to understand a culture, not as a gospel. It doesn't mean that everyone who belongs to the culture will exhibit the same dynamics. It's just a frame of reference to understand that the predominant exposure of that human being would be to that culture and to that behavior. Now, he might completely come out in a different way. That's not the point. It's not defining who we are. It's understanding what the predominant culture is in that particular community. So he did that for nationalities as well. Okay, so those parameters that he talked about are power distance. And power distance is basically how much power, how much distance is there in society between people with different powers. So I can take an example of this. In Japanese culture, for example, as you go up the hierarchy in an organization, the respect levels, the communication style is extremely distant in nature. They're not, for example, just to create a representation, they're not very pally in nature. You address them with sir, etc. And so that's the unit of measurement, power distance. It's not necessarily in corporations, it's in society in general. People with more power are kind of the distance between the next level of power groups, etc. It's very high, and they look up. The natural tensions to look up to different power groupings is high. Individual and collectivism, and that's again societies where it's all about the group. So if you think of a socialist culture, that's very collective in nature as a concept, whereas the typical the hero nature of a group, who's the hero in this, who wins the prize, who sits on top, it's about the individual. Okay, masculinity, and that's about how much the male form is defined very clearly. So cultures with lower masculinity scores, that's where in Scandinavia, etc., the male and the female are seeing together. There's no deep definition of masculinity as a unique concept. The fourth point is uncertainty avoidance. Uncertainty avoidance about risk and how much societies group together to really plan long term. And with the coronavirus and so on, and society's responses to that, how much they're short term, long term. That's a great example of how different societies react differently. Then the long term orientation, and it's not just uncertainty, but how oriented you are toward the long term, how much you're willing to create frames of references that are more long term in nature. Again, different cultures have different parameters. Indulgence, that's pretty self-explanatory, how much indulgence exists in the society. And obviously that's a tough parameter because with globalization, that's starting to infiltrate into multiple societies. So the numbers are changing constantly on a year-to-year with globalization. But at least the historical trend of that culture has got a parameter there. Oops. So these are from last year. So he basically did some scores, and I've got 4 countries here. So if you search Gert Hofstede, he's got a website where for free you can enter in 4 countries, and it gives you the scores across these parameters. You can have a look into it. You can have a play with your own culture, comparing with 3 other cultures, and see the differences. And it's quite fascinating. Again, I have to emphasize, this doesn't mean that all Indians in the blue are 77 power distance, so it's high power distance, so everyone's like that. There's a lot of globalization into, cultural mixing and infiltration of parameters across people. This is not to say everyone who's from a particular culture is that way. It's more to say that people from these cultures are probably exposed to a lot of common traits that are there in these parameters. Okay, I'll give you another 4 more different countries again. So you can see China, Japan, Mexico, and Norway. You can see some of these numbers shoot up. Again, in China, uncertainty avoidance is low, whereas something like a Japan, it's very high. Masculinity is very high. Individualism is low in Japan, whereas it's high in Norway. Power distance, as you can imagine, is high in China. It's high in Mexico. It's medium in Japan. I was just sort of certain thing. So these are parameters based on a particular type of service that's done across the globe. Now, again, I know some people have resistance to parameterizing culture. I will really emphasize it's not a rule or a gospel to define cultures. It's useful as a tool to understand the diversity. And that's a crucial, crucial point I want to emphasize. This is not to define people and box them into squares. This is to be sensitive to what they would have grown up with. And that's a very, very important point. Okay. So what happens again? Yeah, it's some of these numbers are interesting. My own experiences with certain cultures, to Katerina's point she put on the note, is also slightly different. And I'm surprised by some of these numbers. But this is a well-known empirical study. Again, you take it as a frame of reference. You don't kind of stick it in as a black box rule. It's not a hard and cold rule. Anyway, so how do people respond to new cultures? Okay. So typically, and this is about expatriates, when people go from one culture and immerse themselves deeply to another culture. So typically expatriates, and that's the theme of Internations after all. Typically, and again, like the previous models, you don't necessarily have to have all these stages. You could shortcut a stage or completely miss a stage, but typically there's a honeymoon period. That's the period you're very curious. It's like when you go in as a tourist to different places. You know, you're very curious. You don't have the pressure of integrating. You're just wanting to learn. You're curious. You understand. You point to differences. I call it, or it's called the honeymoon period. The second stage is after the honeymoon period, suddenly it hits you and you're in a distress, you're in a shock stage, because it's all right acknowledging that there's differences and being curious, but because you're in that environment, it's tough because you miss the stuff that you were used to. And now you have to make that difference. And that missing of what you used to starts to take impact, and you reach a distress and a shock stage. The third stage is reintegration. You slowly come out of that shock and you start to integrate with the culture that you're now predominantly exposed to. And you begin the process of reintegration. And at the end of reintegration, you reach a certain level of autonomy. And that's kind of the stage in the previous day where I talk about integration. You're comfortable in the new culture. You've got your identity. You haven't lost it, hopefully. And you're still in comfortable level of autonomy where you're not working hard towards integration. You're always learning, but it's not the first stage of baseline integration. The reverse culture shock is an interesting thing. This is something the Hofstede researched. He said that if you come from one culture and go to another culture, and you go through these stages, again, now with globalization, it's not so much of a problem. I myself experienced it 25 years back when I first came to England, and it was not so much global. When I went back to India, you get a sudden reverse culture shock. And I see this among a lot of people. I have friends from other cultures. They say, I would never go back to my country because, oh my God, I can't deal with that. It's a common symptom I see across many people. So that's a reverse culture shock. So you kind of lose your connection to your original culture a little bit. You have integrated into a new culture. When you go back there, there's a reverse culture shock. Any questions or comments on this slide? Okay. Now we talked about culture. I also want to talk about a concept. Again, this is something very unique about when we talk about inclusiveness. And typically we talk about inclusiveness is also about different abled people in our organization or society around us. And a lot of times people, there's a difference between treating equally versus treating with equity. And I'm pioneering something here, which is instead of showing bullet points and talking about what I mean, I'm going to show a few pictures that represent what I'm trying to say. And then you guys can make an observation on what it really means. Hopefully it's clear what I'm trying to say, but please do, tell me what you think about it. I thought the last one was quite funny in terms of, I'm sure there are a lot of you in the audience who believe in the reality version of it. But you see, I did say I wouldn't need to explain, but okay, is that clear in terms of why it's important? Why do people build ramps, disable toilets? I'm just giving random examples, but why is all those things important? And even why is it important to provide a level platform for everyone, irrespective of their initial ability? Any comments from anyone on the pictures I've shown to express what is the difference between treating equally and providing equity to people? Okay, I will move on. So now we've talked about the concepts. There's a lot of theory. There's a lot of stuff about equity, diversity, etc. And now we go to how does it make a difference for you? And that's crucial. Okay. So again, I'll come back to simplicity and simple tips. Key approaches to diversity. I think the first point when you are faced with diversity, make sure you bring out what I will say is the 5-year-old inside you. And why do I say 5-year-old? You know, typically as you're growing up, if you typically see a 5-year-old kid, they're the most curious in terms of things around them. Yes, there's fear, apprehension, but the curiosity level as a stage is like very pure. As long as they get a safe space, they feel safe. Their curiosity is they're like a sponge. They absorb things around them. And in a way, it's very useful and positive to have that curiosity in a very natural and innocent way, where your judgments and perceptions and filters are at their lowest. So try to be as curious as possible. Obviously, again, building bridges, the ability and the attitude to constantly think of building bridges against something you want as a concept. Remember from the previous slide, you always make an extra effort to support equity. Okay, not equality, think of equity. Again, the basic stuff, make sure you're making efforts in a diverse multicultural environment to learn and integrate. And learn and integrate is not necessarily always the job of the minority towards the majority. It works both ways. And it's a very, very crucial. Combined with the build bridges, the learn and integrate is an important factor for everyone as an individual. Okay, and then I want to talk about simple practical things, you know, and norms of communication. And I'll invite some comments, and then I've got a space for people to put in their experiences. You know, what is polite, what is not so polite. I'll give you a personal example. When I was growing up in India, I never experienced anyone giving way on the road. When you get off the bus, you thank the driver. Even if you're angry at someone, you always use please. There's always a thank you. There's a whole form of British communication, and it's not just British, it's many factors. But for me, Britain was relevant because I came from India to Britain that I was never exposed to. So I'm sure when I first came here, it took me a while to come across as a normal, polite. I'm sure people found me very rude in initial communication because I wasn't adapted to that level. For in India, it was common. Even if I had the person I respected the most and loved the most, as I'm walking through the door, I don't even think about opening the door extra. I wouldn't even think of extra pleases and thank yous because that was not the norm at that time. Okay. Again, I'm not justifying one or the other. Being polite is good. You can never be too polite, but also from bringing out my personal experience, it's about communication styles in different cultures are different. And it's easy to react negatively to the difference, either too polite or less polite, but you need to develop tolerance to the fact that there are different norms of communication. Another point is assertiveness. Certain cultures and certain people are a lot more assertive. Their voice is a lot stronger. Their attitude towards personal space. Ali says that as well. Again, that there's something very unique. It's important to kind of match that and understand the differences. Always, as a person, I'd always say, try to be the bigger person in an engagement with any other person. If someone's not so polite, try to be the bigger person, be extra polite. So their levels start to come up. If someone's a bit assertive, be extra gentle, or match them in a level where you find a comfort space. And then the last thing is meaning of the recent example. I say recent, it's quite a bit old now. There's a famous footballer who came from South America, and he plays in a famous English club. And he just tweeted something in Spanish for some of his friends. It was in that culture, that word is okay, but in England and in UK, it's a word that has a potential racial undertone. He was actually banned for 3 games, even though it was universally acknowledged that the difference was because of the difference in cultural awareness. So the meaning of words is very, I myself experienced that when I came here. I come from India, my neighboring country is Pakistan. We have a huge rivalry. When I first came to England, there's a way to represent Asian people, which is very derogatory in nature. But when I was growing up, it was just a common word to describe people from Pakistan. And it was like normal. There was nothing derogatory about it. In fact, I've seen cricket matches. Cricket is a very passionate sport between India and Pakistan, where in Pakistani stadiums, they'd use the short form of Pakistan, and it'll be banners, and it's just been normal. It's just like how you call Australia Aussies, or the Brits instead of British. But in England, it had a heavily racial undertone. So the meaning of sensitive words changes, and it's important to be the lesser of everything. It's important to educate yourself, and that's a very important point. You need to work in a politically correct environment so that there's no insensitive. It's better to limit vocabulary and express yourself in a sensitive way than say that, oh, you are extra sensitive, because negative emotions are never going to be productive in any kind of relationship. I'm sure there's some comments, and Anna George is talking about being extra polite, isolates the cultural awareness. You have to use color. I fully agree. You have to find, again, I'm not necessarily saying be extra polite. It's about building the bridges. It's about learning and integrating. And that's the key point. And always start more safely in general, and then work your way up to the bridge that's effective. That's one thing I will say. Yes, you're right, George, being extra polite could isolate you, etc. But you're better off by being extra polite, taking a slight risk on little extra politeness and working your way up towards the right level, as opposed to being rude and trying to be polite later, because a negative emotion it's always more risky. And education. Again, in the case of footballer, what are the words that work, don't work in a particular culture? Make sure you understand, especially in today's world. There's no excuse. When I first came into this country 25 years ago, there was no internet. There was no this level of global awareness and integration. Today, you have everything at the click of a mouse button or on your phone. There's no excuse not to spend extra time in educating yourself about sensitivities in a particular culture. Okay. I did promise I'll talk about conflict in diverse teams, and I wanted to bring it in terms of what is this conflict and why is it important. Now, I'm going to talk about 2 types of conflicts. First one is cognitive conflict, and the second one is relationship conflict. By concept, cognitive conflict is healthy, should be encouraged, and is something effective organizations should promote. And that's again the execution. Relationship conflict, I'm going to explain what these two are and why they're different in more detail. Relationship conflict is always a bad thing because they come from difference in values and is relationship focus, judgment focus, perception focus. Cognitive conflict comes from a difference of views, a difference of pathways towards a solution, different ideas to get where commonly people want to get to. That's healthy. Relationship is when it's personal, there's negative emotions involved, and that's unhealthy. You can't always separate out these two in a very pure way, but the more you can focus on cognitive conflict, the more healthier that relationship is. And that's a key point. And I'll go back to the point I made earlier, diversity failing because it creates more conflict. The reason is the structure around the diversity is not managed in a way that encourages cognitive conflict, but also nurtures and mitigates against relationship conflicts. So nurtures and encourages cognitive conflict, mitigates against relationship conflict. And that's a crucial execution point. And even if you're in a team, and why is it applicable to you, understanding this element is crucial. When someone disagrees with you on a point, if you are able to see that as cognitive conflict, open yourself to a different pathway and think of an alternate thought and respect that thought for being an alternate thought. It doesn't mean you agree with it, but respect that as an alternative thought and encourage that, because that will also educate you, because that's coming from a different life journey. And that will enrich you because you now have your own thought and that's been enriched by an alternative thought. And there's usually a way to find the best of both worlds. Any comments on the conflict in diverse streams? Okay. How do you manage conflict? Okay, how if you're leading a team, or indeed if you're part of a team, it's very important to create a space for relationship building within the team. You know, organizations and teams, you've seen this all across corporations, you know, team building exercises, etc., all the stuff. And the whole objective in concept, I'm not saying every organization executes it well. And, you know, before someone rushes and says team buildings are a waste of time, in concept, the objective of team building and other activities like that, celebration of festivals, happy hours, the objective of that is to build the relationship element, to provide that space where mutual respect, understanding, appreciation, love, etc. can be built. Also, when you have conflict, always focus on the goals. If the goals are clear and values converge, then conflict will always be healthy. When the goals are not clear and the values diverge, there is a huge risk of relationship conflict. And that's why communication, top-down communication around goals, around values, then encourages and adding encouragement of cognitive conflict, that will give you a very effective, diverse, productive environment. And I'll emphasize that point again. It's really important as individuals to really encourage, make sure if you're, you know, and I've seen this practically in teams, and I'm sure a lot of you have as well, there's always the person who takes over. And if you're the person who's taking over, be really self-aware. And if you really want the best outcome, both for yourself and for the team. And it's important to understand it for yourself as well. Try and proactively solicit feedback and alternate opinion from people around you. It is crucial because that's what develops you, and it will create positive outcomes all around. And make sure you never lose the respect. You know, the whole concept that someone's idea is a dumb idea, it might be sounding that way, but there's always something in that idea that might be useful. So never dismiss alternate ideas, be respectful, and make sure you're encouraging alternate ideas always. That's the themes and the concepts and the practical things I wanted to share. I've spoken a lot. There's been few interactions. I love the fact that there's lots of commentary going on. Excellent. Thank you very much. But now I want to hear a few other voices. We still have time. I'm happy to answer some comments on the session and what they have seen in their environment.
Yeah, I'll go and I'll give you my impressions.